The conference room was quiet except for his voice. Stood at the head of the table, confident and calm, clicking through presentation slides like he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Maybe he had. "The Meridian project failed," he said, his tone measured and professional. "We underestimated the scope. The timeline was unrealistic. And frankly, the execution fell apart." Then he said my name. "This project was assigned to Olivia. Despite resources and support, the deliverables missed mark after mark. We've had to reassign it entirely." I felt the room shift. Eyes moved away from him and landed on me. Someone coughed. The director's expression didn't change. He looked almost sympathetic, like he was disappointed in me, not firing me. I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain anything. And that silence confused him. He expected anger or tears or desperate explanations. What he got was my face, steady and unreadable. He mistook it for defeat. As people filed out of the conference room, I stayed seated, my hands folded on the table. My heart was screaming, but my mind was already moving backward, rewinding through every meeting, every email, every decision. Something didn't align. And I was going to find it. The rest of the day moved in slow motion. Coworkers avoided eye contact when they passed my desk. Some looked sorry. Some looked relieved it wasn't them. One person actually said, "That's rough," like they were offering condolences at a funeral. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain. I just nodded and turned back to my computer. Walked past my desk 3 times that afternoon. Each time he seemed to relax a little more. By the 3rd pass, he was already moving on mentally, already believing the story he'd told was finished. I was contained, managed. What he didn't understand was that my silence wasn't acceptance. That night, I went home and sat in the dark of my living room. My roommate asked if I wanted to talk about it. Said no. I poured myself water and opened my laptop. I started with the project folder. 7 months of work. Hundreds of files. I opened my email and searched for every message related to Meridian. Then I opened the shared calendar and started clicking through meeting invitations. Something was wrong with his story. I could feel it the way you can feel when someone's lying to your face. There's a discord, a note that doesn't fit the melody. I just had to find where the music broke. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't mean to stay awake. It just happened. One email led to another. One calendar entry led to another. Around 2 a.m., I opened the project folder's version history. This is where files live before they're finalized. Drafts, comments, revisions, dead ends. I scrolled through months of development. What I saw made my chest tighten. The final direction, the one said I'd failed to execute, had been approved in a shared document. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the approval signature and the timestamp. It was approved by someone else. Not me. Someone higher. And it was approved 3 days before I was even assigned to the project. I clicked through older files, tracing the decision backwards. The original scope, the budget, the timeline adjustments, all of it predated my involvement. But in the meeting today, had presented it like I'd had control over the entire thing. My hands started shaking. Not from fear. From clarity. This wasn't a failure. This was a frame. By dawn I had filled a notebook with dates, names, and timelines. My coffee was cold. My eyes burned. But I had found the crack. The version history showed that the final project direction was locked in place before my assignment. The approval was signed by Larry, the VP who oversaw. The decisions were made in meetings I wasn't invited to. But in the presentation had said, the execution fell apart. He'd specifically blamed me for the timeline being unrealistic, and the deliverables missing marks. Except I hadn't set the timeline. I hadn't approved the scope. I'd inherited a project that was already broken before my name was attached to it. I opened another search. Meeting notes from before my assignment. There it was. Larry had questioned the timeline. He'd flagged it as aggressive but necessary for Q3 launch. Had signed off on it anyway. The email was dated. The recipient list was clear. Knew the timeline was impossible. He approved it anyway. And then he'd made sure I was the one holding the bag when it failed. I sat back in my chair. The anger I'd expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, I felt something colder. Something patient. He thought he was smarter than me. He thought I wouldn't look. He thought my silence meant I was broken. He was wrong about all three things. I went to work the next day like nothing had happened. I sat in my regular spot. I opened my regular files. I responded to emails with the same professional tone I always used. But everything was different now because I was watching. I watched my coworkers. One girl, Tasha, who usually asked me to lunch, suddenly needed to eat at her desk. Another guy, Devon, hesitated before speaking to me like I was fragile. The woman who sat across from me, she actively turned her chair away. They knew. Not all of it. But they knew something. What they didn't know was that had set this up. What they thought was that I'd failed and now I was toxic. Proximity to me meant proximity to failure. But I watched them watch me and I understood something crucial. They were afraid. Not of me. Of the situation. Of being pulled into whatever they thought was happening. Walked past my desk during his morning rounds. He didn't stop. He didn't say anything. But I caught the micro-expression on his face. Satisfaction. He thought he'd crushed me, and now he was moving on to other concerns. Around noon, I noticed him in a meeting with the marketing director. Through the glass walls, I could see him gesturing animatedly, telling a story. His hands moved the way they had in the conference room. I knew exactly what story he was telling. I opened my notebook and wrote down the time. 3 days later, called me into his office. I want to reassign you, he said, his tone careful. It's not a punishment. You'll still have your salary. But I think you'd be better suited to supporting other project leads rather than heading initiatives yourself. He was offering me a quieter role. Behind the scenes. Less visible. Less powerful. I accepted without argument. He visibly relaxed. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The moment I'd submit. He leaned back in his chair. His body language shifting from cautious to comfortable. I'm glad you're taking this well, he said. Not everyone can handle feedback gracefully. I nodded and stood to leave. Olivia, he called as I reached the door. I think this is actually better for you. Less stress. I almost smiled. He just confirmed something important. He believed he'd won. He thought I was contained now. Safely tucked away. No longer a threat. What he didn't realize was that the smaller chair gave me a better view. I spent the next week in quiet observation. Supporting other projects meant sitting in different meetings, seeing different people, hearing different conversations. And every time told the Meridian story, I wrote down his words exactly as he said them. The story was changing. Details were shifting. Lies were multiplying. Started telling the Meridian story everywhere. In meetings with upper management, he'd reference it casually. We learned some hard lessons with that project, he'd say, looking thoughtful and experienced. Somewhere in the telling, he'd mention that the person leading it struggled with pressure. During team lunches, he'd embellish. Olivia just wasn't prepared for something that complex. I think she did her best, but her best wasn't enough. To other departments, he'd turn it into a teaching moment. We realized too late that she didn't have the bandwidth to manage the scope. Each time he told it, something new appeared. A detail that didn't exist before. Implied weakness I'd never shown. An explanation that contradicted the previous explanation. I documented all of it. The exact words. The dates. People present. My notebook filled with timestamps and quotations. A pattern emerged. Not the pattern of a failure, but the pattern of a liar becoming more comfortable with his lies. Around week 2 of this, I realized something. Was going to keep doing this until everyone believed it. He was going to polish that story until it became the official history. And by the time anyone questioned it, the truth would be buried so deep that nobody would think to look. But I was looking. And I was still quiet about it. In the third week of my reassignment, an email went out from the finance department. Effective immediately, we're conducting an internal audit of all Q2 and Q3 projects to ensure compliance with budget guidelines and timeline management. The audit wasn't about the Meridian projects specifically. It was department-wide. Routine. Maybe even boring to most people. But I recognized the opportunity immediately. Audits don't care about your job title. They don't care about who's popular or who's friends with the right people. They care about one thing, the record. They care about what actually happened, not what people remember happening. I waited until the auditors had been at the office for a few days, getting settled in, requesting files from different project leads. Then I requested a meeting. The lead auditor was a woman named Betty. No nonsense, probably in her late 40s, with glasses and a clipboard. She looked like the kind of person who'd spent decades reading fine print and finding discrepancies. I'd like to provide some context on the Meridian project, I said, sitting across from her in a small conference room. I was the lead, and I want to make sure you have the full picture. She looked up from her notes. What kind of context? Timeline context, I said quietly. The project failed, but I want to make sure you understand when certain decisions were made and by whom. Something shifted in her expression. Not suspicion, but interest. Tell me, she said. I brought her the documents. Not all of them, just the ones that mattered. The version history showing the final scope approval, dated before my assignment. The email from Larry approving the timeline, signed by. The meeting notes from 3 weeks before I started, where and Larry had discussed the aggressive deadline. Betty looked at each one carefully. Her pen made notes on her clipboard. Here's what I'm confused about, she said, looking up. The official project summary says you approved the final scope. I didn't, I said. I was given the scope after it was already locked. I asked for timeline adjustments, but they weren't approved. She flipped through her notes. And you have documentation of that request? I did. I'd sent it as an email 2 weeks into the project. He'd responded with a brief. We need to stick to the approved timeline. Not a rejection, just a statement. Betty read it 3 times. Interesting, she said. Because there's a meeting on the calendar from before your assignment. You weren't invited, but there are notes that reference a scope discussion. My heart rate increased. I was blamed for decisions made in a meeting I didn't attend. Betty set down her pen. That's a significant problem. Those words hung in the air between us. A significant problem. The next day, I was sitting at my desk when Tasha approached me. She looked over her shoulder first, making sure no one was watching. Can we get coffee? She whispered. We went to the break room. Tasha closed the door and turned to face me. Her expression serious. Betty, the auditor, she asked me about the Meridian project, Tasha said quietly. She asked if I remembered when you were assigned. Waited. I told her the truth. I said shut you out of the planning meetings. He didn't include you in early discussions. Then when it failed, suddenly it was your project. My chest tightened. Why are you telling me this? Because I felt guilty, Tasha said. I watched it happen and I didn't say anything. I just let it happen. And I need you to know that I know you didn't deserve that. She wouldn't meet my eyes, but her words were steady. Will you tell Betty that? Yes. I already did, Tasha said. But I won't go on record. Sorry. I know that's cowardly. It's not cowardly, I said. You're telling me the truth. That's enough. After she left, I sat alone in the break room. I realized something important. I didn't need everyone to speak up. I just needed the record to speak up. And the record didn't require courage. The record just required facts. 2 days later, I was doing routine work, supporting another project lead, when I received an email asking about resource allocation. I opened my archives looking for a similar example, and I found myself scrolling through old forwarded chains from the Meridian project. That's when I saw it. An email dated 4 months earlier with a list of instructions. The subject line was, Meridian direction. Finalized. in the email, was explicitly directing how the project should be executed. The timeline was his decision. The scope was his decision. The deliverables were his decision. And at the bottom of that email he'd written, "I've approved this direction with Larry. This is locked. Execute as instructed." I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't a collaborative decision. This was making a call and then assigning it to someone else to fail under. I printed it. I put it in a folder. My hands were completely steady as I did this. All this time had been telling people that I failed to execute a reasonable plan. But the email proved the opposite. Had created an unreasonable plan and handed it to me to fail under. I wondered how many times he'd read this email before forgetting it existed. The next morning I was in a meeting with 2 other managers. We were discussing resource allocation for upcoming projects. It was a mundane conversation. Normal work talk. But I was watching carefully and I asked a question. "For the next project timeline," I said calmly, "who makes the final decision on scope? Just want to understand the process better." Didn't hesitate. "Usually the project lead with my input," he said easily. "Right," I said. "And the timeline? Who locks that in?" "The project lead and I collaborate on that," he said, completely confident. I nodded like I was taking notes. Inside my head I was remembering the email. The email that said, "I've approved this direction. This is locked." "That makes sense," I said. "Thanks for clarifying." The meeting moved on, but had just done something crucial. He'd made a statement about his process that contradicted the documentary evidence I had. He was over-explaining. Overconfidence was exposing him more than confrontation ever could. I didn't need to argue with him. I just needed to let the truth arrive when the time was right. 3 weeks into the audit, HR called me into a small office. The HR director, a woman named Keisha, was sitting behind a desk with a folder. "I wanted to touch base with you about the Meridian project," she said, her tone casual. "Do you have any insight into what went wrong?" This was the moment. I could feel it. "I have quite a bit of insight," I said carefully. "The project was assigned a timeline and scope that were finalized before I was brought on. When I requested adjustments, they weren't approved. When the timeline proved unrealistic, I was blamed for failing to execute an impossible plan." Keisha's expression changed. Her pen moved to paper. "Do you have documentation of your timeline requests?" "I do," I said. She nodded slowly. "We've been reviewing the project files as part of the audit. I wanted to get your perspective." After I left that office, I understood. They had already found the inconsistencies. They had already seen the documentary evidence. Keisha was just confirming my story matched the record. Which it did. Perfectly. Over the next 2 weeks, I organized everything with obsessive precision. Not arguments, not opinions, just sequence. I created a master timeline. Date and Larry approved the initial scope. Date of approval. Date emailed final direction. Date I was assigned. Date of my timeline adjustment request. Date it was denied. Date project began failing. Date of each meeting where told the story. No editorial commentary. No emotional language. Just facts in order. What emerged from this sequence was clarity. Undeniable mathematical clarity. The truth, when arranged properly, becomes impossible to argue with. You can't debate a timeline. You can't negotiate with a date. I added the documentation to each date. The email. The approval signature. The version history. The meeting notes. The calendar invitations showing who was present and who wasn't. When I was finished, I had a document that was 40 pages long. Pure sequence. Pure record. This document was going to end. Not because I was angry, but because truth, when presented correctly, needs no anger. I saved it to an encrypted folder on my computer. Waiting. The email came on a Monday morning. Leadership Project Review. Friday 2 p.m. Conference Room A. Attendees. Senior management, project leads, selected support staff. The Meridian project was listed as one of the projects under review. Received the same email. I watched him read it. His expression didn't change. He didn't see this as a threat because he thought the story was finished. He thought I was contained. Friday morning I printed my timeline document. 40 pages. Clean. Organized. Fleming. I didn't give it to. I sent it to Keisha in HR with a simple note. Timeline documentation for the Meridian project review. At 1:55 p.m., I walked into conference room A. Was already there, confident and calm. He'd prepared his talking points. He looked relaxed. He had no idea what was about to happen. The review started at 2 p.m. with a different project. By 2:45 they moved to Meridian. Began presenting. He told the story, the one he'd perfected over weeks. He explained the timeline. He explained the failures. He explained what we learned. Then the IT director pulled up a document on the shared screen. It was my timeline. Stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went to the screen. For half a second, just half a second, I saw it. Confusion. Then recognition. Then something that looked like fear. He recovered quickly. What is that? He asked, trying to sound curious rather than panicked. The project timeline, Betty the auditor said calmly. From initial approval through execution. The screen showed the version history. The dates. The approvals. The room was completely quiet. Cleared his throat. That timeline doesn't account for the scope adjustments, he said, trying to regain control. There were significant changes made during. According to this, Betty interrupted, pointing to a section of the timeline. The final scope was locked 3 days before Olivia was assigned. She was reading directly from my document. Reading the facts. Reading the sequence. Shifted tactics. Yes, but she had the opportunity to adjust it once she. A timestamp appeared on the screen. The email I'd sent requesting timeline adjustments. Response. We need to stick to the approved timeline. That was denied, Betty said simply. The room stayed silent. Larry, the VP, was reading the document intently. His jaw was set. He was adding things up in his head. Tried again. The execution was. The timeline requirements were unrealistic from approval, Betty said. That's documented here. Multiple times. She wasn't arguing with him. She was just reading what the record said. Opened his mouth again, but Larry held up a hand. Let's review this document more carefully, Larry said, his tone measured. Before we continue the review. The room grew quiet again. But this time the silence wasn't pointed at me. It was pointed at. I watched his face. I watched him understand in real time that the story he'd been telling had collapsed. That the documentary evidence contradicted him completely. That being confident and articulate wasn't going to help him when the timeline was locked and the approvals were signed. He looked at me for a moment. I don't think it was a conscious look. More like his brain was automatically searching for an explanation. I met his eyes and said nothing. Just like I'd said nothing in that first conference room. Larry turned to look at me. His expression was different now. It was the expression of someone who just realized he'd been fed a version of events that didn't match the record. Olivia, he said, thank you for providing this documentation. He nodded. Had gone pale. After the meeting was paused, Keisha from HR asked to speak with privately. They left the room. That's when things accelerated. Tasha came to me within an hour. They're asking everyone about the project now. I told them what I told you. That shut you out of the early planning. Devon, who'd been avoiding me for weeks, messaged me in the afternoon. I'm corroborating your timeline with my own calendar records. Told me not to include you in prep meetings. I should have questioned that. Another colleague, Larry's assistant, sent me an email. The documentation you provided is consistent with what I observed. I'm prepared to confirm the timeline with leadership if needed. Fear was giving way to relief. People were choosing truth over loyalty to. By the end of Friday, 4 people had voluntarily confirmed aspects of the timeline. Not because I'd asked them to, but because the documentary evidence had made the truth undeniable, And once the truth was undeniable, people stopped protecting the lie. Did something on Monday that surprised me. He came to me directly. He was trying to appeal to me, to negotiate. "This was a misunderstanding," he said in a low voice. "The communication around that project was unclear. I was protecting you." I said nothing. "Olivia, I made a mistake. But I was trying to do what I thought was right. Surely you can understand that." I could have argued. I could have told him exactly what I thought of him. Instead, I just listened. "I'd like to discuss this with you before it goes further," he continued. "Before this becomes something bigger." He was asking for mercy, asking me to intervene, asking me to stop the process he'd put in motion by lying. Finally spoke. "The timeline speaks for itself." That was all I said. He tried one more time that afternoon to tell leadership a different version of events. A version where he'd tried to protect me and made communication errors. Betty pulled up an email. The one where he'd written to Larry. "I've approved this direction. This is locked. Execute as instructed." The word protect didn't appear anywhere. The word error didn't apply to a deliberate decision. The lie that was supposed to save him ended what was left of his credibility. Tuesday morning was called to a meeting. No drama. No raised voices. No confrontation. Just procedure. Larry requested his presence. Char was involved. They didn't ask me to be there. They didn't need me anymore. I watched from my desk as walked toward the senior management offices. His posture was different now. Muller. Less certain. By 11 a.m., an email went out to the department. "Will be stepping away from his current role to focus on other opportunities within the company. During this transition, Larry will assume oversight of all active projects." That was it. 42 words. No explanation. No accusation. No details. Everyone knew exactly what it meant. His power didn't dissolve in a dramatic confrontation. It dissolved quietly, through procedure, through process, through documentation. He wasn't fired, not yet. But his authority was paused, suspended, pending further review. The silence that had been pointed at me for months was now pointed at him, permanently. By Thursday, the official project documentation was amended. The scope history was corrected to show who actually approved each decision. The timeline was annotated with the dates and deadlines that had imposed. The execution phase was reframed, not as a failure of leadership, but as a failure of planning. My name came off the blame section. It went into the context section, accurately describing my role, my constraints, and my requests. The corrected documentation was sent to every stakeholder. This was the official truth now. Not the version had been telling. Not the interpretation that made him look good. But the actual sequence of events, recorded and preserved. His role in the project was reclassified. From strategic director to decision maker. The distinction mattered. One made him sound competent. The other described what actually happened. 2 weeks later, a company-wide email announced S. departure. "We're grateful for his contributions during his time with us. He has decided to pursue a new direction that better aligns with his goals." It was the kind of announcement you see all the time. Neutral language. No accusations. No explanations. Everyone understood anyway. People who'd heard him tell the story 100 times suddenly remembered the timeline. They remembered my quiet acceptance of a reassignment. They remembered Betty's audit appearing out of nowhere. The dots connected themselves. Rumors started, some accurate, some not. But the accurate version involved documentation, not gossip. It involved a timeline, not emotion. My reputation didn't recover through argument or explanation. It recovered because the record was corrected. By the time I actually left the office for the last time, something had shifted in how people treated me. Co-workers met my eyes again when they passed my desk. Some apologized without words. Just a nod, a small gesture. Respect had replaced pity. Tasha asked me to lunch again, and this time I said yes. Devon approached me in the hallway. "I'm sorry I was distant," he said. I was afraid. But I should have stood up sooner. I told him it was okay. And I meant it. Larry called me into his office. Your work on the Meridian project was solid, he said. You were given an impossible situation and you handled it professionally. I should have noticed that. I accepted his acknowledgement without anger. It wasn't about him anymore. The silence that had been my camouflage during the investigation became something else. A sign of strength. People started seeing quiet determination instead of defeat. I'd won by not breaking, by not shouting, by letting the truth arrive on its own schedule. 3 months after left, I accepted a promotion with a different director. It wasn't about getting ahead. It was about moving forward. The day I walked out of the old office for the last time, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. Felt intact. I didn't win because I was louder then. I won because I was more honest. I didn't win because I retaliated. I won because I documented. The anger I'd felt in those early mornings, scrolling through emails and timelines, had transformed into something else. Not forgiveness, but acceptance. Had tried to erase my identity by taking credit for success and blame for failure. I'd restored it by refusing to participate in his narrative. I'd walked out unchanged on the surface. No scars. No drama. Just a person who'd found her way back to the truth. The lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about silence. Not the silence of weakness, but the silence of someone gathering evidence. The silence of someone letting the record speak for itself. The silence of someone patient enough to let the truth arrive on time. I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing and let the facts do the talking. And facts, unlike stories, don't change their shape. They just wait for the right moment to reveal who you really are.